A warm welcome from me as well. Many thanks to the organizers for setting this up. It's a really great opportunity to have this exchange between people who are interested in the theoretical development of the democratic planning part and those who have the technical expertise to build socio-technical infrastructures in the very concrete terms. And of course, there's luckily an overlap between those two groups. I believe this exchange to be absolutely necessary, and I think that we should kind of cultivate it beyond this workshop today, since the questions that emerge from our overlapping interests will stay with us and will have to be worked through in what can only be an interdisciplinary collective process. So my input today is only 10 minutes long, so I will merely tease some questions and possible fields of inquiry that I believe to be of importance for the broader debate around democratic planning, focusing on questions around the more technical side of things. I'll jump quite a bit since this is more of a collection of thoughts than a coherent presentation, but I hope it will at least provide some food for further discussion. So I thought I'd start with my take on the question that forms the title of this workshop. Does the economy fit into a matrix or a tensor? Stated this way, the answer to this question is a decisive no, I would say. In order to make yourself believe that the economy with a capital E could fit into a matrix, you would have to reduce your idea of what that means, the economy, to a very narrow understanding based on discrete calculable objects and processes, thereby neglecting a host of social and political factors that are absolutely part of the economy. Ultimately, what we call the economy today is comprised of social relations, and the aim of using algorithmic technologies in the context of the planning debate should be to open up new possibilities for collectively organizing and coordinating these social relations, and not to subtract the social and political aspect of these social relations for the sake of abstract representation that allows for subsequent calculation. This already points towards a question we should always keep in mind and occasionally check up on. What are reasonable use cases for these algorithmic technologies, and at what point do we ascribe abilities and possibilities to them that only seem viable because we allow ourselves to ignore crucial aspects of the broader picture? An extremely narrow idea of what you take to be the economy is one more abstract example for this type of tunnel vision. Another very concrete example for the field, from the field of machine learning would be the way in which large language models can only seem economically viable if I allow myself to ignore the environmental cost of computation, as well as the exploitative labor practices involved in training these large models. All this is to say, we should not make things fit by force in order to be able to use a certain technical gadget. Instead, we should make a well-considered assessment of where certain technologies make sense and where they do not make sense. And as far as I understand it, this workshop today aims at doing exactly that. So thank you for that, by the way. And just to make this link to the planning debate also, there is a epistemic reason. There are epistemic reasons for the no to fitting the economy into a matrix as well. Within the planning debate, the argument brought forward on epistemic grounds is that the dispersed knowledge of people on the ground cannot be centralized due to its implicit and tacit nature, and that any attempt to do so would lack the dynamism needed in order to effectively coordinate within an ever-changing dynamic world. Okay, so much to on the title question. I spent the rest of my 10 minutes hopping from one loosely connected question to another. So please excuse the lack of an overarching narrative there. As I said, consider the following more of mental notes for further discussion maybe. So the first quite general question I want to bring up is, what do we mean by optimal if we speak of an optimal plan? I know we will talk quite a bit about optimization algorithms today, but let me be a heretic in this context here and say that for me at least, optimal planning necessarily involves deliberate inefficiency. Economic calculative optimality is not a virtue on its own. Optimization does have a place, that for sure, but we should be careful not to put the wagon before the horse. I can easily think of many scenarios, and I'm talking about socialist proposals here, where the primacy of optimality leads to absolutely undesirable outcomes. And it might sound like an oxymoron to some of you that optimal planning necessarily involves deliberate inefficiency, but essentially it's just stating that there is much more to optimality than just calculative economic efficiency. I think this still sometimes gets lost in the planning debate, specifically when it comes to proposals that lean heavily on technical parametric mediation. Another mental note that I want to bring up would be the question, how can the social role of interpreting data be cultivated? If there's no such thing as raw data, then we need to talk about the role that the creation and interpretation of data plays within democratically planned economies. If we imagine these economies to be heavily reliant on a multiplicity of data, and I think we all kind of do, then the work of creating and interpreting data is an essential part of world making that needs to be reflected upon. Related to that, many questions pop up that need to be answered differently from the way in which they are handled today. Who decides over the variables that form the basis of a given algorithmic model? Who has the power to overrule certain data and why? And questions like these are all the more important given the direct link between notions of planning and traditions of technocracy that we should definitely avoid replicating. However, this is not only a critical, but also a constructive work, I would say. It points towards a positive potential to embed and cultivate a different relation towards modeling and simulation, away from being an instrument of technocratic control and power, towards becoming a shared cultural technique, a cultural technique of collective interpretation and experimentation. So the cultivation of such skills beyond circles of so-called experts, I might add, is also a relevant question for the planning debate in terms of information. There is no neutral model, and much of the output of a given model depends on what its programmers believed to be important variables. So alternative assumptions on what the important variables to consider are can therefore be helpful in trying to achieve a more comprehensive picture and at the same time distribute the political influence that comes along with modeling. So we should, and this would be a next mental note, so to speak, engage in fostering cultures of simulation. And when it comes to such cultures of collective modeling and simulation, I'd like to at least mention an algorithmic approach different from the optimization algorithms that will likely form the center of discussion today, and that is agent-based modeling. There's a research project I can highly recommend. It's called Society After Money. It's led by Jens Schröter, and they have they make use of agent-based modeling as an experimental tool for modeling alternative economies. In their case, it's a so-called commonism that they model, developed by Stefan Meretz and Simon Sutterlüti. And in a recent paper titled Computer Games and Economic Models on the Way to Transformation Critical Media, Lina Gerdes, Jens Schröter, and Manuel Scholz-Weckele push this approach even further, I would say. And they discussed, and I quote here, the extent to which simulation might develop into an experimental medium for collectivizing societal utopias, end quote. So what they are arguing for is to develop a serious game that allows for collective experiments in societal transformation based on a merger of agent-based modeling and massively multiplayer online role-playing games. And this is, of course, a very experimental and also playful approach. But I'd like to stress that, at least for me, it is precisely this realm of collective experimentation that forms the most interesting and promising aspect when it comes to the realm of possibility that is being opened up through technological developments. And this, this brings me to my last mental note, so to speak, which I titled Infrastructures of Collective Experimentation. I would argue that neither algorithms for static allocative efficiency nor more dynamic approaches in the form of algorithmic forecasting are able to get to the really interesting parts of what alternative technological infrastructures might provide for us. While both are certainly useful in specific use cases, they both seem to be somewhat structurally conservative, I would say, and I would be very much interested in the opinion of people working in the field on that assessment. The former, algorithms that aim for static allocative efficiency, rely on some form of closed system in which an optimization algorithm can calculate an equilibrium of some sort. And this, however, neglects openness, dynamism, and the question of the new in favor of a closed system that can be neatly optimized and calculated. While an optimization of knowns, of course, has its place, as I already said, such an approach is inadequate as an overarching paradigm of organizing our collective economic relations. We want the change and openness that the world provides us with and should not dampen it down through structural ignorance. Similarly, in the case of forecasting, the really interesting questions do not come into the picture. It is structurally conservative in a different way, I would say, namely by reproducing the future based on an extrapolation of the past. And this, of course, might help with a more precise forecasting of needed milk production in order not to run out of cheesecake. And for this, it absolutely makes sense, I would say. But the truly intriguing questions and possibilities when it comes to what modern day technologies might provide for us lie somewhere else. It's not about a hunt for narrow economic efficiency through the optimization of the old. It's about providing socio-technical infrastructures that allow for collective coordination and experimentation within an open field that is always in flux and changing. And I think such an approach neatly matches with a huge open question of the planning debate, namely that of transition. We should start to more actively think of our models of democratic planning as a process of transition. And many of the questions we ask ourselves within the planning debate will only be answered in practice, and the experiments that form this practice are an essential part of the transition itself. What we should pursue then is to engage in a creative construction around socio-technical infrastructures that allow us to engage in meaningful collective experimentation around the many open questions of the planning debate. This includes playful but serious experimentation, as mentioned in the context of the Society After Money project, but it can also crucially include something like digital platforms that allow for experiments in the kind of meta-coordination that is all too often lacking in a sea of separately acting left initiatives. I'm thinking about the work of Thomas Swan, for example, Thomas Swan's work on anarchist cybernetics here, who of course builds on Stafford Beer's viable system model as an inspiration. So a key takeaway for me is that when it comes to the interesting affordances, the realm of possibilities that is provided through technology today, then the interesting part is not so much about optimization, but about coordination. And since my time is kind of running out, I guess, I would like to end here with a quote by Stafford Beer, who said, "Amongst many others, I have often claimed that in planning, it is the process, not the product, that counts." Thank you.